Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're diving into a concept that, well, it fundamentally shapes our world, yet our minds seem uniquely unprepared to deal with it. We're talking about the Black Swan.
hmm Those highly improbable, high-impact events.
Exactly, and how our brains, struggle to understand them.
And our source material for this deep dive comes from excerpts of the book, The Black Swan. It's a text that really challenges how we think about uncertainty, knowledge, and maybe even the structure of reality itself.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So our mission really is to extract the core ideas from this text, try to understand the true nature of uncertainty, at least in certain domains,
Ah,
and identify the mental pitfalls, the traps that blind us to the unexpected.
right. Let's unpack this. Maybe start with a foundational idea the source uses. It illustrates it with a really classic example.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. So before Europeans encountered Australia, everyone in the old world was absolutely certain all swans were white.
Completely certain.
And this wasn't just a guess, right? It was based on centuries, millennia even, of just relentless observation. Every single swan they'd ever seen
Everywhere they looked.
was white. It was like a deeply held truth, totally supported by all the evidence they had.
And then, boom, that truth was shattered. Just like that.
By a single observation.
The sighting of one solitary black swan in Australia. It completely invalidated that universal belief.
And the power of that story isn't really about birds, is it?
No, not at all.
It's about highlighting a severe limitation in how we learn from just observing things. Seeing is believing.
Until it isn't.
Exactly. Until that one observation proves everything you thought you knew wrong. It shows how fragile knowledge can be when it's built purely on induction from, well, what you've seen in the past.
Precisely. And this leads us straight into the core definition of a black swan event, as the source describes it. First, it's an outlier.
Okay.
It lies way outside the realm of regular expectations. Because really, nothing in the past convincingly pointed to its possibility.
Right. And second, it carries an extreme impact.
Huge impact.
Yeah, think about just the conceptual impact of that single black swan invalidating a truth held for ages. Black swans aren't just rare, they're transformative. They change things.
And third, there's this cognitive element, this twist. Despite being unpredictable outliers, human nature drives us to concoct explanations for them after the fact. We tell ourselves these stories
Oh, right.
that make the event seem explainable, maybe even predictable, but only in hindsight.
That's the retrospective distortion, making the unpredictable seem, well, inevitable after it happens.
Yeah, that I knew it all along feeling, but you only feel it afterwards.
Right.
So the book makes this really bold claim.
Yeah.
Our world, it argues, is actually dominated by these extreme, unknown, and very improbable events, the Black Swan.
Dominated by them.
Yeah, yet our focus, our models, our thinking, it's all geared towards the average, the known, the stuff that repeats.
So the source is saying we need to flip that, we need to change our perspective entirely.
Kind of, yeah. Instead of treating extreme events as just, like, exceptions or aberrations, we should maybe acknowledge they're fundamental and use them as a starting point for understanding the world, especially certain parts of it.
Okay, that's a big shift.
It is. And this brings us to a really crucial distinction the source makes. It's central to this whole idea. Mediocristan versus extremistan.
Mediocristan and extremistan. Okay, they sound like places from a fantasy novel.
Yeah, maybe a bit. But in a way, they describe different statistical landscapes,
Yeah,
different
yeah.
kinds of reality.
Okay, so what's mediocristan?
Mediocristan is where individual observations don't really change the total or the average much. Think about human height or weight in a group.
Right, if you add one really tall person to a room of 1,000 people, the average height doesn't change dramatically.
Exactly. The tallest person doesn't, skew everything completely. Extremes can happen, sure, but they're rare, and their impact on the big picture is pretty negligible. You can comfortably use averages and standard statistics here. Things are, well, relatively behaved.
Okay, so mediocristan is where you find those nice, predictable bell curves and stuff.
Pretty much. That's their
Yeah.
natural home. Extremistan, though, that's a different beast entirely.
Okay.
That's where extremes are hugely consequential.
Yeah.
Massively important. This is the domain of things like wealth, book sales, financial markets, casualties in modern wars,
Yeah.
stuff like that.
So in extremistan, one single observation, one event can just completely dwarf everything else.
Totally. It can disproportionately impact the total. Think about Bill Gates walking into a room, his wealth versus everyone else's combined.
Right. It makes the average wealth meaningless.
Exactly. Or think of book sales. One massive bestseller, like Harry Potter, outsells thousands and thousands of other books combined, making them almost invisible statistically.
Or a single market crash.
A single event can bring the whole system down. Extremistan is the natural habitat, the breeding ground for black swans.
And understanding this difference, this distinction between the two, that's critical.
Absolutely critical. The source argues that applying the tools and the thinking from predictable mediocristan to the wild, unpredictable world of Extremistan, that's where we get into massive trouble.
That's where the mistakes happen.
Which leads us right into the human biases, the limitations in our thinking that make us so blind to black swans and these extreme events, especially in Extremistan. The source really digs into several key cognitive traps.
Okay, let's explore some of these ways our brains kind of trip us up. The first one is called platonicity.
Platonicity, yeah. It's our inherent tendency, maybe even a need, to focus on clean, well-defined concepts and models, the sort of maps we have in our heads,
Right.
rather than the messy, complex reality, the actual territory out there.
Like wanting to see perfect triangles or idealized political systems, or even thinking of simple categories like chairs or birds as having these strict, unchanging definitions.
Yes, exactly. We gravitate towards these neat, tidy, platonic ideas. But this makes it harder for us to grasp or deal with things that have much messier, less defined structures, things that don't fit neatly into our boxes. We end up confusing our simplified model with the full, complex reality.
That makes a lot of sense. We simplify to understand, but that simplification itself, well, it can hide the really crucial, complex bits.
And related to that is the narrative fallacy.
Okay.
This is our deep-seated, probably biological drive to create stories, to make explanations for events, even if they're totally random.
We just can't stand ambiguity, can we? We have to make things make sense. We need a story.
Exactly. And this instinct, it helps us navigate a predictable world, sure. But when we face real randomness, it can lead to serious oversimplification. It distorts reality. And crucially, it gives us this false sense of understanding, especially about complex random events.
So we feel like we get it, even when we don't.
Right. The source notes that narrative thinking can be, frankly, lethal when you apply it to understanding true uncertainty. It makes us focus on the sensational, vivid events that fit a neat story.
The ones that grab headlines.
Yeah. And we ignore the abstract, less story-friendly black swans, even if they're potentially more impactful.
So we weave a simple, compelling story around a few things we happen to see, and then we mistakenly believe that story is the whole complex picture.
Precisely. And that tendency feeds directly into another trap, the confirmation error, or, confirmation bias.
Ah, yes, this one's familiar.
It's our tendency to actively look for and favor evidence that confirms what we already believe, while we conveniently ignore or dismiss or just downplay anything that contradicts our beliefs.
So if I already think X is true, I'll subconsciously scout for examples that prove I'm right.
And guess what?
Lo and behold, I'll find them easily.
Absolutely. The source is really critical of what it calls naive empiricism. Just collecting anecdotes that happen to fit your preferred story isn't real evidence. It's just storytelling.
Right.
And this bias helps explain why people with totally different viewpoints, political, religious, scientific, can look at the exact same data
Yeah.
and walk away even more convinced they were right all along. They just interpret it through their own lens.
So more information doesn't necessarily lead to agreement.
Sometimes, the source suggests, it can paradoxically make you feel more certain of your existing flawed views because you just found more stuff to selectively confirm your bias.
Wow. That's a powerful feedback loop. Scary, actually.
It really is. Okay, let's consider another insidious bias. Silent evidence.
Silent evidence.
This is the invisible data, the data of what didn't happen, or what didn't succeed, or maybe who didn't survive.
The things we don't see because, well, they're not there anymore, or they never even got started.
Exactly. We don't see the vast graveyard of failed businesses, do we? We only see the shiny few who made it, the survivors.
Right.
We don't see the countless actions by engineers, doctors, pilots that prevented disasters. We only focus on the disasters that actually happened.
Like the engineer whose bridge stands solid for 100 years, nobody notices, but the one whose bridge collapses.
Becomes infamous, right? We only see the failure, not the vast landscape of non-failure. It's that idea of what is seen and what is not seen.
Okay.
And this bias makes us systematically underestimate the risks people took or the huge role that pure luck plays in outcomes. We look at the survivors in evolution, in business, in just everyday life, and we tend to attribute their survival purely to skill or fitness or inherent stability,
Forgetting all the others.
forgetting all the identical peers who had similar skills but just got unlucky and failed or perished. We fall for this illusion of stability because we only see what hasn't failed yet.
That's a really profound point. We learn from the winners, sure, but the lessons from that invisible graveyard of losers, they might be even more important for understanding risk.
That might be crucial. Okay, next trap. The ludic fallacy. Ludics meaning related to games.
Okay, the ludic fallacy.
This is mistaking the clean, predictable kind of randomness you find in games like perfectly balanced coin flips, fair dice rolls, or those simplified casino models based on fixed probabilities. Mistaking that kind of tamed randomness for the wild, untamed, scalable randomness of real life, especially in Extremistan.
So real-world uncertainty isn't like a controlled casino game. It's not just rolling dice.
The source argues vehemently against that.
hmm
Real-world randomness has what they call fat tails. It has those unpredictable, high-impact extremes that the game-based models just completely miss.
Because they assume extreme events are virtually impossible.
Right. And the source claims even sophisticated models used by casinos fail to account for their own biggest risks because those risks didn't fit the neat game-like probabilities.
Interesting. Okay, what's next? Domain specificity.
Domain specificity, right.
Yeah.
Our brains seem to use different mental tools, different modules, depending on the context of the situation.
How so?
Well, it means you might be incredibly rational, evidence-based, and skeptical within your specific area of professional expertise. Let's say you're a surgeon meticulously evaluating clinical trial data.
Okay. Very careful.
Very careful there. But you might be completely susceptible to biases like the narrative fallacy or confirmation bias in your personal life, or when you're making decisions in a totally different domain, like managing your investments.
Ah, like the brilliant scientist who demands rigorous proof in the lab but then falls for some crazy conspiracy theory they read online.
Precisely that kind of thing. Understanding a concept or a way of thinking in one area doesn't automatically guarantee you'll apply it correctly somewhere else. Our brain isn't one single uniformly rational machine. It compartmentalizes.
Got it. Okay, finally, the planning fallacy. I think I know this one.
Yeah, most of us do from experience. This is our systematic tendency to severely underestimate the time, the cost, the resources needed for tasks, especially new or complex ones.
Tell me about it. Every DIY project ever.
Exactly. And the source points out this happens even when there's no incentive to lie or mislead. It's just a cognitive glitch.
Why does it happen?
It seems to be a consequence of being too narrowly focused on the internal details of the project itself,
Right, the steps involved.
while pretty much ignoring all the external uncertainties and potential Black Swan-like disruptions that almost inevitably crop up, things going wrong that you didn't plan for.
Yeah.
And the source notes that the quality of forecasting just degrades dramatically the further out you try to predict. It becomes almost meaningless.
And the source makes that slightly cynical point that a lot of bureaucratic forecasting is really just for anxiety relief, isn't it? Not about actual accuracy.
Yeah, it's highlighted as another example of our deep desire for predictability overriding the messy reality, just making us feel better.
I think many people can relate to that feeling.
Definitely. And there's a related point the source makes too. We tend to underestimate the frequency and impact of extreme events overall. We think things that might happen every decade are like once-in-a-century events.
We downplay the probability.
Yeah. But interestingly, for very sensational events, the ones that get a lot of media coverage, the narrative fallacy can kick in and cause us to actually overestimate their likelihood in the future.
Oh, right, like fear of flying after a major crash is reported.
Exactly. So the point is, our judgment of extreme events is just highly fragile. It's prone to severe miscalculation be both directions, underestimation and overestimation.
Okay, so given all these biases and the inherent nature of this place called Extremistan, it sounds like using traditional statistical tools, especially that famous Gaussian bell curve, is, well, incredibly problematic.
Problematic is putting it mildly. The source launches a really significant critique, calling its widespread use outside specific mediocristan domains like basic physics a great intellectual fraud.
Wow, strong language. Why is it considered so bad?
Well, the core issue, as the source explains it, is that the bell curve is really only applicable in mediocristan, where extremes don't matter much.
Where things cluster around the average.
Right. But using it in Extremistan completely ignores, completely disregards the potentially massive impact of those rare events. It effectively focuses all its attention on the grass, the bulk of the data near the middle,
Uh-huh.
while completely missing the potential trees, those huge deviations way out in the tails that can actually dominate the whole picture in Extremistan.
Because the bell curve basically assumes that massive deviations are so unlikely they're practically impossible, right? The probability drops off incredibly fast.
Yes. And it also relies on assumptions that often don't hold in real life, especially in Extremistan.
Right.
Like the idea that events are independent, that one thing happening doesn't influence the next.
But that's often not true.
Right. Think about cumulative advantage success, breeding more success.
Yeah.
That violates independence. Think of network effects or the rich get richer phenomenon. Those aren't independent events.
So phenomena like wealth distribution or book sales or market crashes, they just don't follow a bell curve.
Not even close, according to the source. It argues the bell curve's ubiquity isn't really a property of the world itself, but more a problem with how we choose to look at the world, how we simplify it. It's a comfortable Platonic shortcut that's become deeply entrenched.
Even though it fails.
Even though it consistently fails to predict or explain real-world Extremistan events, as shown by things like forecasting competitions. And academic training, the source suggests, often focuses heavily on these mediocristan methods, leaving people unprepared for the realities of Extremistan.
And there's that critical point about asymmetric proof, right?
Exactly. One single black swan observation, just one, can completely blow up the assumption that something follows a Gaussian distribution.
But seeing millions of data points that do fit the bell curve.
Can never fully confirm it's valid, because the truly impactful curve-breaking event might just not have happened yet. You can never prove the absence of a black swan using a Gaussian framework. It's fundamentally limited.
Wow, okay. So if the bell curve is the wrong tool, the wrong map for understanding Extremistan, what framework is more appropriate? What does the source suggest?
The source introduces Mandelbrottian randomness, named after Benoit Mandelbrot, the father of fractal geometry, as a more applicable model for these kinds of phenomena.
Mandelbrottian randomness. Okay, what's different about it? What distinguishes it?
Well, it describes what's called scalable wild randomness. Scalable is the key word.
Scalable.
Yeah. Unlike mediocristan distributions, which have sort of inherent scales where averages tell you a lot, Mandelbrottian distributions can produce, in principle, arbitrarily large numbers. They exhibit inequalities without clear upper bounds.
So there's no theoretical cap, no ceiling on how extreme an event could be.
That's the core idea. And it has that fascinating property Mandelbrot is famous for. Scale invariance, or self-affinity, like fractals.
What does that mean in practice, scale invariance?
It means that if you look at phenomena governed by this kind of randomness, think about the jaggedness of a coastline, or the branching patterns of trees, or maybe price movements in financial markets. The statistical patterns can look remarkably similar, whether you're looking at a very large scale or zooming way in to a much smaller scale. Complexity arises from simple iterative rules, but the outcomes can be wildly unpredictable and non-linear.
And this applies too.
Things like wealth distribution, the sizes of cities, links on the internet, and, as mentioned, financial markets seem to follow these patterns much more closely than a bell curve.
But the source also says it's hard to get precise numbers out of this, right? Estimator exact parameters is difficult.
That's true. Precise numerical prediction remains incredibly challenging, maybe even impossible, especially for those extreme tail events. But the key takeaway isn't about plugging numbers into a perfect formula. It's the conceptual shift. Acknowledging the potential for massive, scalable impact, which the Gaussian framework simply blinds us to. It changes how you think about risk.
Okay. And all of this makes the process of induction, learning from past observations to predict the future and figuring out causation much, much trickier, doesn't it? Especially in these complex environments prone to black swans.
Absolutely. The source talks about what it calls the inverse problem.
The inverse problem.
Yeah. It's vastly harder and much more prone to error to try and infer the specific causes from an observed result than it is to predict a result from a known cause.
Ah, like looking at a puddle of water on the ground and trying to figure out the exact shape of the ice cube it melted from?
Exactly. Many different ice cube shapes could lead to a very similar puddle. Trying to infer one simple single cause from a complex outcome. That's another form of Platonicity, really. Assuming the simplified story you see in hindsight was the only possible path.
And in Extremistan, those simple cause and effect chains we like to build, they're often just plain misleading.
Very misleading. The advice is to be extremely wary of simple because explanations, especially when you know silent evidence is likely hiding crucial factors you can't see. And the source points out, contrary to our narrative-loving instincts, big events often don't have big, obvious, linear predecessors. Think about the start of the Great War.
Yeah.
There wasn't some comparable prior event that clearly signaled that scale conflict was coming. Or the massive 1987 stock market crash.
Yeah.
You couldn't just simply predict that specific drop from the market movements right before it in a linear way.
So blaming a big event on a single big cause might just be the narrative fallacy working overtime after the fact, constructing a story.
Very often, yes. In complex, non-linear systems, tiny inputs can sometimes have massive delayed effects, that classic butterfly effect idea. So trying to learn from the past using simple induction in these systems becomes incredibly unreliable because the links between cause and effect aren't always simple or visible or linear. They're often hidden and complex.
Okay, so if prediction is so unreliable, especially for these huge impact events in Extremistan, what the source calls the fourth quadrant, dealing with complex payoffs from unpredictable events, what can we actually do? How are we supposed to navigate a world we can't reliably predict?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. And the focus shifts entirely. It moves away from prediction
Okay.
and towards preparation, resilience, and robustness.
So first things first. Avoid prediction, especially long-range predictions or predictions of specific large impacts.
Exactly. Prediction in Extremistan is presented as not just unreliable, but potentially dangerous if it gives you a false sense of security or encourages you to take on hidden risks you don't understand.
So instead of trying to predict, the strategy is more about building robustness and avoiding errors.
That's the core idea. The source strongly advocates for focusing on what not to do, identifying and avoiding fragility, avoiding known pitfalls,
Right.
rather than trying to offer precise, positive, predictive advice. That kind of specific prediction, the source suggests, is often the domain of charlatans or people who just don't grasp the true nature of uncertainty.
Okay. So avoid fragility. Don't build yourself, your company, your financial plan, whatever, in a way that's vulnerable to extreme events, to those black swans.
Precisely. And interestingly, naive optimization, trying to make everything super efficient by removing redundancy, cutting buffers.
Lean and mean.
That actually increases fragility. It makes the system brittle. The source points out that Mother Nature loves redundancy. We have two kidneys, not one super kidney. Complex natural systems have multiple layers of backup.
That's a good point.
Over-specialization can also be dangerous. And large entities or systems that are built under this illusion of perfect efficiency and stability, they can be incredibly vulnerable to black swans because they lack the slack, the redundancy, the adaptability to absorb unexpected shocks.
And the source points directly to the 2008 financial crisis as an example of this, right? Not an unpredictable black swan in itself,
Not according to the source, no.
but a predictable, maybe even inevitable result of building a fragile system based on faulty models and a fundamental ignorance of Extremistan's realities.
That's exactly the argument. It was seen as a consequence of ignoring fragility, of building on flawed, mediocristan-based assumptions.
Okay, so avoid fragility. And then there's the flip side, trying to maximize your exposure to positive black swans. Good surprises.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
While you're trying to shield yourself from the nasty surprises, you also want to position yourself to benefit from the unexpected good ones. The strategy suggested is basically tinker, explore, take many small bets, lots of them, where the potential downside is limited, but the potential upside could be huge and unexpected. Collect opportunities.
Sort of like how major scientific discoveries often happen, or how venture capital works.
Exactly like that. Breakthroughs are often unplanned, unpredictable, but can have massive positive impacts. The source suggests that free markets work, partly, because they allow people to get lucky through aggressive trial and error, taking lots of small swings, knowing most will miss, but hoping one connects for a massive, unpredictable payoff.
So make lots of small, low-risk experiments or bets where failure isn't catastrophic, but success could be game-changing. And be quick to cut your losses on the ones that don't pan out.
That's the philosophy. And conversely, actively cut your negative exposure. Limit your vulnerability where you can. Stay away from situations where unknowledge, where a black swan could severely harm you. Protect your downside.
This whole approach seems to require certain mental discipline, too. Developing skepticism, embracing, what did you call it? Learned ignorance?
Learned ignorance, yeah. It's hard because it goes against our grain. We want to theorize, we want to feel certain, we want to have answers.
Right.
But The ancient skeptics like Sextus Empiricus, they advocated for withholding judgment, for acknowledging what you genuinely don't know. And the source really emphasizes avoiding that common error, confusing absence of proof with proof of absence.
Just because a devastating earthquake hasn't happened on this fault line yet doesn't mean it can't or won't.
Exactly.
Oh.
That links right back to the silent evidence problem. We don't see the past disasters that didn't quite happen.
Makes sense.
The source also makes an interesting distinction between scalable and non-scalable professions or activities.
Scalable and non-scalable.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Non-scalable activities are things like, say, dentistry or massage therapy. Your income is generally predictable because you trade your time directly for money, and there's a physical limit to how much you can work or produce.
Right. Your income is kind of capped by the hours in the day.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Scalable professions, on the other hand, things like being an author, a scientist, a trader, an entrepreneur, they offer the potential for massive Black Swan-like upside.
Uh-huh.
One single book, one discovery, one trade,
Mm-hmm.
one hit product could yield immense disproportionate rewards, completely disconnected from the hours you put in.
There's a catch.
Big catch. These scalable fields also have a huge, largely invisible cemetery of failures. For every wild success, there are countless others who tried and failed spectacularly or just fizzled out.
So the average outcome might not be great, even if the potential upside is huge.
Exactly. The source suggests that the real payoff for many individuals pursuing these scalable activities might actually be the hope, the possibility of hitting that positive black swan, as much as any predictable material success.
Interesting. So given all this uncertainty, the fallibility of experts using flawed models, the whole nature of extremistan, the source offers some pretty pointed advice for, ordinary citizens regarding crucial parts of their lives, like finances.
It really does. It strongly suggests that people should not rely on fallible expert advice, especially forecasts.
Yeah.
And perhaps more controversially, it suggests not putting your crucial security, like retirement funds, primarily into financial assets and markets.
Why?
Because those markets are presented as being firmly, undeniably in extremistan. They are subject to these wild, unpredictable swings.
So the message is, don't treat the stock market like some safe, predictable savings account based on what economists or advisors are predicting.
That seems to be the core argument, yes. The source goes so far as to suggest that economic life for ordinary citizens should perhaps be definancialized. Maybe investments, if you do them, should be seen more as entertainment or speculation or that tinkering we talked about.
Ball bets.
Small bets, yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than the absolute bedrock of your future security.
Because the underlying system, at least in the source's view, is built on fragile assumptions and is inherently subject to unpredictable high-impact events that conventional expert models consistently fail to account for, let alone predict.
That's the fundamental reasoning presented.
Yeah.
And again, the 2008 crisis is held up as the prime exhibit, not some freak accident, but a devastating and perhaps foreseeable consequence of building a highly leveraged, interconnected, fragile financial system based on those flawed Gaussian models and completely ignoring the realities of extremistan.
Right. Okay, so wrapping this up, what have we really learned in this deep dive? What are the key takeaways?
Well, I think we've learned that black swans aren't just, weird, rare events.
Yeah.
They are fundamental, maybe even defining features of extremistan. And extremistan governs so much of our modern world finance, history, technology, even personal careers to some extent.
And crucially, our natural way of thinking, all those biases we talked about, Platonicity, the narrative fallacy, confirmation bias, ignoring silent evidence, the ludic fallacy, they make us systematically blind to these events and their potential impact. We constantly underestimate the true level of uncertainty in extremistan.
Yeah, we're wired to miss them, almost. And trying to predict them, or manage the risk they pose, using tools like the Gaussian bell curve, tools only really suited for the tame world of mediocristan. That's not just futile, it's actively dangerous. It creates fragility.
So the key isn't prediction then, it's something else entirely.
It's about building resilience, intelligently managing our exposure to the unknown.
Right, building robustness by actively avoiding fragility, maybe even embracing redundancy sometimes, cutting our exposure to those unpredictable negative outcomes.
Protecting the downside.
And at the same time, positioning ourselves to potentially benefit from the positive, unpredictable events, the good black swans, by tinkering, exploring, taking lots of small contained bets.
And it also requires a kind of radical skepticism. Skepticism about our own understanding, about the models we use, about expert predictions in domains where they have a poor track record.
Okay. Thinking about all this, it really raises a pretty profound question, doesn't it? For you, listening.
Mm-hmm.
If our minds are fundamentally wired, in some ways, to miss the most impactful extreme events that shape our world, and if we consistently overestimate how much we actually understand, how can we truly trust our own judgment? How can we trust our perceptions when we're trying to navigate a world so clearly dominated, in parts, by the unknown and the unpredictable?
That is definitely something to mull over.